And I know we're a little bit off on the schedule from the book, but we've got the room for the next 20 minutes or so. So we're going to open it up for these guys to take questions from you all. So thanks for your patience. Yep. Here we go. Got our first question here.
Hi, thank you all very much for the discussions. One of my colleagues has a quote that he always shares with us, which is from Dr. Bill Foege, talking about the smallpox eradication campaign and saying that one of the keys to successes was recruiting people who were too young to realize that it couldn't be done. So maybe you could just give a few words of advice to someone like myself working on something as challenging as malaria eradication on how have you maintained that optimism and enthusiasm and avoided the cynicism that can sometimes accompany multiple failures over the course of an impressive career like yours.
Well, one trick is to have multiple things going on at the same time. So if 3 things fail, you have 1 success.
I think it's important to have a public face and share some of the frustrations. I think sometimes we share things with the young people and discourage them unnecessarily. I remember reading about the Kennedy family. Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch, would not allow them to talk about money at the dinner table. Talking about money in front of young people probably is not good policy, and the inability to get grants does not encourage the next generation. So I think in part it's good sense to be optimistic. Of course, we all face frustration, and that's where having a terrific assistant can be helpful. I remember my assistant Trish would bring me a list of people that insisted they see me right away. And I'd tell Trish, so-and-so, tell him to go fuck himself. And Trish would promptly call the person up. Dr. Augury does not think this would be a good time for a meeting.
I think a couple of things that are incredibly helpful. One is I think the optimism is genetic. I think it really you inherit. Now, humor is an incredible softener of self-deprecating humor. I thought Peter's self-deprecating humor was a little bit like my own, and my kids laughing at me, teaching me how to do things. It's a very hard field. I was at CDC where I didn't have to write grants all the time, but where if I didn't write grants, I would have a lab of 4 people, and by writing grants, you could do anything you wanted. And when we got for years, we had limited money, but when we got the Gates funding and when I spent a year at WHO and was able to link what we were doing to the World Network, it really spread the pain and spread the joy, so that now we have international meetings, and many of the people are people who trained with us and all moving ahead. And when you see now we have vaccines that are way out there, but they're not fully effective. We do need a next generation of vaccines, and there is a research agenda ahead of us. So it's keeping your eye on a vision and knowing that sometimes you're not always successful or going as fast as you like to be. But if you keep with it, tenacity and perseverance are important qualities.
Feel free to come to the mic.
Come up to the mic.
Hi, I'm Ann Mormon from the University of Massachusetts, and I have a small story to tell about a conversation about failures versus successes, and then a question for the panel. So as a young PhD student, and I shall not name names of who my PhD advisor was, I was in the lab working really hard, and this kind of speaks to what you're talking about, the balance of what you're doing and taking yourself very seriously. And I was working really hard in the lab, and my advisor came in, and he somehow knew the one experiment that failed. And he's like, well, what's going on with this? And I turned around and I was a little stressed out. And I said, can't you just walk into the room and say, how's it going, Anne? And he turned around and left. I thought, oh my God, I've just kind of yelled at my advisor. So the next day he walks into the lab looks right at me and says, Anne, how's it going? And then I could tell him about all the things that worked. And then we talked about what was not working, and we kind of worked together to troubleshoot that. And so that experience led me to kind of stand up for myself and say, like, think about the things that are working and not just focus only on the things that aren't working, because all of us as scientists and driven people want to succeed, and we kind of focus too much on the things that aren't working. And so now, as an associate professor, my department chair is saying, get more grants, write, papers in Science, Nature, and Cell. And so how do you change that conversation so that they see your successes and they just aren't focused on getting grants and writing papers and getting grants and writing papers?
Who wants to take that one?
Get a new department chair. You can always threaten to quit.
Hey, Anne, how's it going?
Very well, thank you. No, there's a lot of pressure about grant funding, and being persistent is great, but when it takes 2 years to get one R01, it's really, really tough out there right now. And so a lot of good scientists are leaving academia because we can't get grants. And I know there's, advocacy talks about how to talk to, our government officials and how to fund research and why that funding's important through the CDC, NIH, all these government funding organizations as well as private foundations and stuff. So, that's part of what we don't learn when we're in our training is how to advocate for funding and things like that. So, it's really tough in mid-career people.
No, there's no doubt about it. Failure is really depressing. It's not fun to fail. But I think that's just a fact of life. But I think that when you do have a failure, you can go back and think you can really figure out why you failed and what, rather than just taking it. I think that the trick with failure is you take it as a personal affront. You failed, or you're not a good scientist. That's what it feels like when you get a failure. And they're not the failure that when you get a rejection, it's not saying that you're not a good scientist. It's saying we didn't like you doing this, this, and this. And so what you have to do is, just, live with it, and then but also figure out why specifically they thought you failed.
So I don't have a solution for how you focus only on the positive and not raise the negative, because I'm a big believer in learning from the negative. But I think somebody else said this earlier, I don't remember who, but for me, I think one important thing was always to have more than one grant, more than one project, and diverse projects, because always then when you have one failure, you've got others that may be going great. The other thing to think about is multiple sources of funding. You mentioned, industry. You mentioned foundations. The Department of Defense, fortunately, through advocacy, I think, has a much better research budget than they've had in years past, last year, this year. And I think, obviously, they have a lot of special needs, so that's a good source of funding, particularly in the area of tropical medicine. So, but otherwise, I can't solve the problem of how you don't, especially as a former chairman, have to bring up the negative, because it is the reality of the situation.
I would just say that, Fogarty budget was zeroed out by the president last year. And it was because of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health, our partners and grantees around the country, that Congress came right to our aid and increased our budget then, and they increased the budget of NIH, and we've had increases now for 4 years. So it's an amazing that there is an increase in budget after 10-year hiatus or so. The second is that globalization is with us in the 21st century. And when we look at NIH grants, they've grown, the international grants have grown by over 100%, doubling, including in the developing world, over the last, I think it's 8 years that we just reviewed. So there's a lot more interest. The publications by NIH-funded grantees, a third of their co-authors are international. So we're going towards globalization. The Global Alliance for Chronic Disease is an international funding for the NCDs. They're incredibly new opportunities. And finally, epidemics are not going away. If anything, they're going to be more as we go into the future. And the Global Health Security Agenda and CEPI and a bunch of these other activities are going to be with us and provide new and interesting opportunities. I always thought that linking your horse to bioterrorism or health security was a funny argument with the devil. But if you think about CDC, the CDC was started as the Epidemic Intelligence Service. We were dealing with intelligence and the fear of chemical and biological warfare after World War II. And it was that fear, and I think Bill Foegge's new book is called The Fears of the Rich, the Needs of the Poor. And if we can fuel the funding from the fears of the rich, we can take care and begin to address the needs of the poor in the same way.
Roger, to that, I would just add that one of the more, I think, successful or impactful reports from the U.S. National Academies was one that was issued in 2005. And it was a request from Congress of the academies, what is it going to take to keep the U.S. competitive in science and technology? I was lucky. I was one of the 20-member committee, but it was chaired by the former CEO of Lockheed Martin, Norm Augustine, and a good mix between academics and industry. But at the end of the day, it was the industry that carried the weight, that carried the report to Congress. It was mentioned for 3 successive years in the, well, anyway, we don't have time to go into the details. The bottom line was that it was very apparent to everybody that without economic success, the money's available to continue to invest in research. There's no way. So the synergism between the private sector, economic stability, and being able to increase funding, there's no question. So I think, again, this delicate balance between the private sector, the public sector, government, it's absolutely the case, especially when it comes to funding.
So I think with that, we'll let people head to their next session. But I just want to give a special thanks to our 4 speakers for taking the time.
Yes, big thank you.